Chapter 12, Part 1, Battlestar Galactica, CIC 0614 town hours. The FTL displacement wave hit Dradis like a heavy hammer through glass. Not the phantom ghost from 2 days ago, not a faint flicker at extreme sensor range. This was a tidal wave of sheer energy that swept across the integrated Colonial Federation sensor net, turning every screen in CIC a blinding white-hot glare. "Contact!" Duala shouted. "Massive FTL signatures, plural, bearing 227, range 400 kilometers." Ty reached the plot table before the echo of her shout faded, his abandoned coffee mug rolling unheeded across the deck plates. "How many?" "Two, Colonel. 2 base stars, launching raiders from both ships. The count is climbing. 300, 400, still climbing. They had materialized together, 2 double Y monstrosities ripping out of faster-than-light transit with a brutal, instantaneous violence that no Federation warp drive could ever emulate. No deceleration, no warning. Just empty space, and then 2 capital ships bristling with launch bays, vomiting raiders into the void in continuous, unrelenting streams. 600 fighters spread across the dark in a swarming, chaotic pattern, turning the space between the base stars and the Colonial fleet into a solid wall of angular metal and kinetic death. Ty hammered the shipwide comms, his gravelly voice cutting through the action klaxon already screaming through every corridor. "Set condition 1 throughout the fleet. This is not a drill. All hands to battle stations. Launch everything, every Viper, every Raptor, now!" The Galactica shuddered violently as the launch tubes fired. Vipers catapulted into the void. The Mark IIs led the charge, their freshly reinforced wing roots flexing under the massive launch stress and holding solid like iron, their engines burning 15% cooler than they had before the Norway's engineers spent a grueling night in the hangar bay. Behind them, the Raptors launched in pairs, each ship carrying upgraded Federation sensor packages and ECM suites capable of surgically targeting specific Cylon coordination frequencies instead of just broadcasting blind electronic noise. Adama arrived in CIC at a dead run. He hadn't removed his boots. He never removed his boots. "Saul, talk to me." 2 base stars, Bill. Both jumped in close. 400 clicks. They're launching everything they've got. Over 600 raiders and climbing. Adama looked at the plot table. 2 base stars, not 1. The tactical picture he had prepared for. The precise scenario Lee had modeled, and Starbuck's cap rotation was structured around, assumed a single base star assault. 2 base stars shifted the geometry of the battle from desperate to utterly catastrophic. Munition status, 10% conventional. We've got maybe 9 minutes of sustained fire before the magazines are dry. 9 minutes against 2 base stars. 9 minutes was nothing. After that, the Galactica was just a 60-year-old armored hull with nothing left to throw. Norway, Galactica actual. Patel's voice came back immediately. He was already at battle stations, his crew moving with Starfleet precision. Galactica, Norway. We have the picture. 2 base stars. That's double the raider count we planned for. Captain Patel, your ship and the Saratoga are the fleet's primary defense. My batteries will support for as long as they last. When I go dry, you are the wall. Understood, Admiral. The wall holds. Saratoga? Captain Voss responded, her tone clipped and precise as she actively maneuvered her Miranda class into the exact flanking position she and Patel had ruthlessly drilled for 3 weeks. Galactica, Saratoga. Turbo phases charged, all torpedo tubes loaded. I have the Norway starboard flank. We're ready. Pegasus. Lee's voice came through tight with controlled focus. Galactica, Pegasus actual. Mark 7 wing launching now. All birds upgraded. We're coming in on the port flank. Adana looked down at the plot table one last time. 63 fragile civilian ships huddled in the center of the formation. 2 battle stars, 1 bleeding dry at 10% ammunition. 3 Federation ships, 2 warships, and a science vessel that had no business surviving a firefight. And outside that fragile perimeter, 600 Cylon raiders closing in from 2 vectors simultaneously. All units, engage at will. Protect the civilian fleet. Nothing gets through. Part 2. Viper M7242C, combat space. Starbuck cleared the launch tube and flew straight into the teeth of it. The sky was an absolute swarm. Raiders filled every vector, their sharp, angular silhouettes catching the cold starlight as they collapsed on the fleet in overlapping, suffocating waves. 2 base stars meant 2 distinct swarms converging from different bearings, creating a massive pincer movement that the defensive formation couldn't possibly cover with a single unified kill zone. Her Viper answered her hands with a sharp crispness that hit her nervous system like a mainline adrenaline spike. The controls were unbelievably tight. The engine response was immediate. Gone was the sluggish half-second delay she'd suffered through for 14 months, replaced by an instantaneous translation of thought to thrust that a combat pilot desperately needed to survive the oncoming slaughter. Beneath her, directly inside the wing roots, where silent metal fatigue had been slowly building toward a lethal structural failure, The duranium composite laminate held the airframe together like an uncompromising iron fist. All Vipers, Starbuck. Weapons free. Stay in pairs. Cover your wingman. Raptors, I need ECM now. Jam their coordination on the frequencies Spock identified. Make them fly stupid. The Raptors, 4 of them, 2 from each Battlestar, activated their electronic countermeasures. The upgraded Federation sensor packages locked onto the specific Cylon coordination bands with a surgical precision that Colonial ECM had never been able to achieve. Instead of just screaming white noise across all frequencies, the Raptors now surgically severed the subspace data links that held the Raider swarm together. The effect was instantaneous and visible. The lead Raider formation, the closest wave bearing down on the fleet's port flank, stuttered in space. Individual Raiders broke from their lethal emergent pattern and flew wide, their coordination visibly degrading as the jamming scrambled the network that made them a unified swarm instead of 600 isolated fighters. Starbuck violently banked into the gap. Her first kill came 3 seconds later. A Raider stripped of its formation reference, flying a stiff, predictive pattern that her upgraded targeting display read like a children's textbook. 2 heavy bursts chewed into the engine section. Fire. Kill. The second kill came 5 seconds later. 2 bursts. Kill. Galactica. Starbuck. The ECM is working. They're flying sloppy on the port swarm. Starboard swarm is still coordinated. The Raptors can't jam both base stars simultaneously. Lee's voice cut through the comms. Starbuck, Apollo. My Mark 6s are engaging the starboard swarm. Targeting upgrades are performing perfectly. The Koskov class is outstanding. We're cutting through them. Don't get cocky, Apollo. There's 600 of them. I can count, Starbuck. Count faster. Part 3. USS Norway. Forward batteries. The Norway opened fire at exactly 0617, and the entire Colonial fleet finally saw exactly what Federation energy weapons could do. The ship's phaser arrays reached across the dark void, their beams lightly touching the portside Raider formation that had been ruthlessly closing on the Gemenon Traveler. The beams didn't strike the way kinetic artillery rounds struck. They didn't impact with brutal concussive force or scatter metal debris across the grid. They simply erased. The entire leading edge of the Raider formation ceased to exist, instantly converted from solid armored matter into expanding plasma in the microscopic space between heartbeats. 12 Dradis contacts vanished simultaneously from the board, not destroyed, erased. In CIC, Ty watched the contacts vanish on the plot table and felt something he hadn't experienced since the colonies fell. Not hope. He was entirely too old and too brutally honest for hope. It was surprise, the genuine visceral shock of a seasoned veteran who thought he had seen every possible way a ship could kill, only to watch a terrifyingly new one. What in the name of the gods was that? He breathed. Norway's main phaser battery kernel, full power. The Saratoga hit exactly 3 seconds later. Captain Voss had maneuvered her Miranda class into the precise location Lee's tactical scenarios predicted the Raider swarm would logically compress, the lateral zone where Raiders, frantically maneuvering away from the Norway's forward fire, bunched together like panic animals fleeing a predator. The heavy turbo phasers mounted on her nacelle pylons swept the heavily compressed formation with brutal, intersecting beams of energy. The photon torpedoes firing from her roll bar, launching forward and aft simultaneously, caught any Raiders that desperately tried to break above or below the horizontal phaser plane. The tactical pairing worked flawlessly. The Norway's devastating forward battery forced the Cylon fighters to maneuver laterally. The Saratoga caught them mid-turn. Between the 2 Starfleet ships, Raider formations that entered the crossfire died in dozens, rather than 1s and 2s. Patel's voice came over the joint frequency. Galactica, Norway. We're holding the port flank against the first base star. The kill zone is effective, but the second base star's swarm is approaching from starboard and we can't cover both vectors simultaneously. That was the critical problem. 1 Norway and 1 Saratoga could create a flawless kill zone that absolutely nothing could survive. But they physically couldn't be in 2 places at once, and 2 base stars meant 2 massive attack vectors. The port swarm was rapidly dying in the Federation crossfire, but the starboard swarm was pushing through the grid, with only the Pegasus and Lee's Mark 6 left to slow the bleeding. Adama made the call. All Vipers, new doctrine. Push the port Raiders into the Federation kill zone. Herd them, don't chase them. Apollo, hold the starboard flank. Starbuck, I need you to buy time on the starboard approach until the port swarm is neutralized. Starbuck banked violently and hauled her section across the formation. The Mark II's engine screamed in protest as she pushed it through a punishing course change that would have undoubtedly snapped her wing roots just 6 days ago. The wings held. She rocketed toward the starboard swarm, her section tightly forming up behind her, 8 Vipers and 2 Raptors serving as the dangerously thin line between 600 mechanical killers and 50,000 helpless civilians. Part 4. Combat Space. Starboard flank. The starboard swarm hit Starbuck's section like a tidal wave crashing into a seawall. The Raptors were jamming one base star's coordination frequency, the port swarm. They simply couldn't jam both simultaneously. The starboard raiders were flying perfectly coordinated, their emergent patterns terrifyingly intact, their kinetic fire concentrated and overlapping. Every approach vector was blanketed by multiple raiders providing seamless crossfire. Flying into the starboard swarm was flying directly into a steel web. Starbuck flew into it anyway. She killed 3 raiders in the first 15 seconds, joint targeting with her wingman, as the upgraded Mark II's targeting display fed her lethal firing solutions she'd never had access to before. But for every raider she broke apart, 5 more closed on the fleet from impossible angles she couldn't cover. The starboard flank was far too wide. 8 Vipers couldn't possibly hold a line that required 30. Lee's Mark VI joined from the Pegasus, 12 birds, heavily upgraded with Koskov's optical enhancements and power distribution recalibrations. They slammed into the starboard swarm's trailing edge and started cutting. The dramatically improved weapons response delivering faster, cleaner kill shots than the standard Mark VII configuration ever allowed. Lee flew point. He was precise, deeply disciplined, every single kill meticulously calculated to disrupt the enemy's formation geometry rather than just reduce the raw head count. The Pegasus herself opened fire. Her conventional batteries, colonial kinetic weapons, adhering to the exact doctrine the Cylons understood and had heavily armored against, hammered the starboard radar screen with punishing sustained volleys. The raiders absorbed the kinetic fire exactly the way they were designed to. Colonial rounds smashed into colonial spec armor and produced colonial spec damage. Assured kills, but slow ones. 1 round per raider, sometimes 2. The Pegasus guns were ruthlessly effective, but they were fighting exactly the way the Cylons expected. Then, the Galactica fired. Adama had been meticulously hoarding his dwindling ammunition. 9%, then 8, treating each volley as a brutal calculation of diminishing reserves against a mounting existential threat. Now he committed half his remaining magazines to a single, staggeringly concentrated barrage directly onto the starboard swarm's center mass. The massive rounds tore entirely through the formation, annihilating raiders, scattering survivors, and ripping a gap in the approach pattern that lasted exactly long enough for Starbuck's section to desperately reposition. Galactica, Starbuck. The gap is closing. We need the Norway on this flank. The Norway is holding the port kill zone, Captain. If she moves, the port swarm reaches the civilian fleet.
Then somebody better come up with a plan B, because I am running out of raiders to kill before they run out of me.
Part 5. Battlestar Galactica, CIC. Adama stood frozen at the plot table, watching 2 separate battles unfold simultaneously. On the port flank, the Norway and Saratoga were methodically grinding the first base star's raider swarm down to glittering debris. The kill zone was holding. The Federation ship's energy weapons were terrifyingly devastating. Each phaser sweep casually erased contacts the colonial guns would have required sustained, punishing fire to destroy. The port swarm was rapidly dying. On the starboard flank, the second base star swarm was brutally pushing through. Lee and Starbuck were fighting brilliantly, wringing performance out of the upgraded Vipers that went far beyond any colonial specification, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. The Pegasus was hammering the formation with her massive batteries, but the Cylons had adapted and armored perfectly against kinetic fire. They were rapidly losing the numbers game on the starboard side. And the Galactica was bleeding out at 4% ammunition. Tie. When the port swarm is neutralized, how quickly can the Norway reposition to the starboard flank? 3 minutes at full impulse, maybe 2 if Patel pushes it. We hold for 3 minutes. The Galactica fired again, targeted bursts, not sustained volleys, but precise, deeply economical shots aimed exclusively at raiders that had broken through the Viper screen and were making lethal runs on the civilian ships. Every single round was a heavy decision. Every trigger pull expelled ammunition that absolutely could not be replaced. TI called each shot like a master surgeon calling for instruments, bearing, range, single fire. The first base star, the one whose raider swarm was being systematically shredded in the Federation kill zone, began pulling its surviving raiders back into a tight defensive formation, contracting around its hull exactly the way the Rogue 3 in any other timeline would have done. Without its radar screen pushing forward, the base star was just a capital ship without escorts, incredibly dangerous at range, but fatally vulnerable up close. Norway Galactica. The port base star is consolidating. Her radar screen is combat ineffective. Can you reposition to the starboard flank? Already moving, Admiral. 2 minutes. Make it 90 seconds. The Norway violently turned, her Constitution-class hull pivoting with a sleek grace that completely belied her massive bulk, and accelerated toward the starboard engagement zone. The Saratoga held the port position alone, her multi-arc coverage keeping the consolidated first base star completely honest while her partner repositioned. 93 seconds later, the Norway's phaser arrays reached the starboard raider formation. The effect was immediate. The exact same devastating erasure that had utterly gutted the port swarm now slammed into the starboard raiders from a direction they had never anticipated. The tight formation that had been relentlessly pushing Starbuck and Lee back instantly disintegrated. Raiders were vaporized in massive clusters, their cohesion totally shattered by energy weapons they possessed no defense against. Galactica Starbuck. Kara's voice was raw, breathing hard, carrying the exhausted sound of a pilot who had been redlining for 20 solid minutes. The Norway just saved our asses. The starboard swarm is breaking up. The tide was turning, but 2 base stars were still out there. Their raider swarms were diminished, but they were not eliminated. Their main batteries were still firing, launching heavy kinetic salvos arcing across the void, each individual round capable of entirely gutting a civilian transport, and the Galactica was at 2% ammunition. Part 6. Combat Space. The Stalemate. The second base star rapidly pulled her surviving raiders into the exact same defensive contraction the first had executed. It was a painfully tight formation around the hull, with point defense overlapping until the swarm became a physical iron shield rather than a sword. Both base stars now sat entrenched in space, surrounded by their contracted radar screens, their main batteries continuing to relentlessly fire from range. The fleet couldn't possibly close the distance without entering the deadly overlapping point defense envelopes. The base stars couldn't push their raiders back out without immediately losing them to the Federation kill zone. It was an absolute stalemate. The Galactica's magazines were finally empty. The last round had been fired 90 seconds ago. It was T's final call shot, a single desperate burst that caught a raider making a suicide run on the Tylium tanker and turned it to flaming scrap, a mere 300 meters from the civilian hull. Starbuck's voice cut sharply through the tactical frequency. Galactica, Starbuck, these two are going to sit there all day. We need to kill at least one of them, or we're all just going to stare at each other until somebody blinks. She paused. Somebody needs to shove a torpedo down one of those things' throats. On the Norway, Lieutenant Commander Reyes was intensely monitoring the battle from the engineering station. She had been listening to Starbuck's transmissions since the engagement began. A photon torpedo down a base star's throat. Reyes looked at the Starfleet weapons inventory. Photon torpedoes were ship-launched, tube-deployed, and completely guidance-integrated. You couldn't just detach an antimatter warhead and crudely strap it to a colonial missile. Except you could. Captain Patel. Not now, Reyes. Sir, the colonial pilot is right. I can build it. Patel turned. Build what? A photon warhead on a colonial Javelin missile. Strip the warhead, bypass containment and guidance, mate it to the Javelin's propulsion. A Viper carries it on the wing pylon and delivers it directly into the base star's hull. No guidance necessary. Point and shoot. Patel stared at her. How long? 15 minutes. I need 1 torpedo, 1 Javelin, and a fabrication jig. You have 15. Go. Part 7. USS Norway. Shuttle Bay. Reyes built the weapon in exactly 13 minutes. The photon torpedo lay violently open on the Shuttle Bay deck. The casing was split, the warhead completely exposed, and the antimatter containment flask sat glowing in its housing like a beating heart inside a cracked chest. She stripped the warhead free and set it delicately on the mounting jig right beside a Colonial Javelin missile sourced from Galactica's inventory during the previous supply exchange. The Javelin was brutally simple. It featured solid fuel propulsion, a standard mounting collar for conventional warheads, and was designed explicitly for a Viper's wing pylon. The mounting geometry absolutely didn't match. The power bus was totally incompatible. The dimensions were completely wrong. She fabricated a crude adapter from spare hull plating, cutting, violently shaping, and fitting the metal with the exact same portable tools she'd used to reinforce wing roots 2 nights ago on a hangar deck that smelled heavily of grease and terrible coffee. The custom adapter mated the volatile photon warhead directly to the Javelin's bus with raw mechanical precision. The detonation trigger was hardwired straight into the firing circuit. Absolutely no guidance, no computer, no networking. The pilot aims and the pilot fires, point and shoot. It was the crudest possible delivery system for the most devastatingly powerful conventional weapon in the quadrant. Norway to Galactica. I have a package for Captain Thrace, 1 photon warhead on a Colonial Javelin. She needs to land on the Norway for loading, and she needs to understand 4 minutes of containment stability, no guidance. She points her bird at the target and fires. Inside the hull, it kills the ship. Against the armor, it just hurts. Starbuck's voice came back immediately over the comms. Norway, Starbuck. I heard everything. I'm inbound. Part 8. USS Norway, Shuttle Bay. Starbuck brought the Mark II in incredibly hard. It was a desperate combat landing that violently scraped sparks across the Norway's immaculate Shuttle Bay deck, making the Federation crew visibly flinch. She was scrambling out of the cockpit before the canopy had even fully opened. Reyes was already waiting with the modified Javelin. It looked profoundly wrong. It was a colonial missile with a Starfleet Federation warhead brutally grafted onto it. The adapter collar was obviously improvised, and the internal wiring was fully exposed. It was ugly, crude, unquestionably the most dangerously unstable thing either of them had ever built. 4 minutes from the moment I armored Captain. After that, containment degrades and the warhead becomes unstable. You need to be inside the base star's hull when it detonates, a launch bay, a breach point, anywhere the blast propagates through internal spaces. Against the outer armor, you'll damage her. Inside, you kill her. How close? Inside. Literally inside. Starbuck looked down at the volatile weapon. She looked back at Reyes. That drink I owe you just got upgraded to the whole bottle. Reyes' engineering crew carefully mounted the Javelin onto the port wing pylon. The Viper's weight distribution shifted immediately, noticeably heavier on the port side, aggressively pulling at the handling. Starbuck noted it, filed the physics away in her mind, and climbed quickly back in. Reyes silently held up 4 fingers. 4 minutes. The launch tube pressurized. The Viper shot violently back into the void. Part 9. Combat space. The run. Starbuck cleared the Norway with a live photon warhead dragging on her wing, and exactly 4 minutes on a ticking clock she couldn't even see. The second base star, the one whose raider swarm had relentlessly pushed the starboard flank, the one that was now heavily turtled behind its point defense screen, hung massive in the void directly ahead of her. 300 raiders stood directly between her and the hull. She keyed the fleet frequency. Galactica. Starbuck. I need a hole. One hole through the radar screen on the second base star, wide enough for one Viper. I need every gun in the fleet on bearing 165 for 15 seconds. After that, I'm on my own. Adama's voice came back without a single breath of hesitation. All units, Galactica actual. Concentrated fire bearing 165. Everything you have, 15 seconds, on my mark. Starbuck banked incredibly hard, the heavy port-mounted Javelin aggressively pulling at her flight controls. She fiercely compensated, her muscle memory flawlessly adjusting for the asymmetric load. Years spent in this specific cockpit translating into an instinctive physical correction that happened entirely below conscious thought. She built speed on a heading perpendicular to the base star, putting critical distance between herself and the massive target. She was going to need the distance. She needed maximum velocity, faster than the massive radar screen could react, faster than the point defense cannons could track, faster than any sane, rational pilot would ever push a Mark II with an unstable antimatter warhead strapped to her wing. 3 minutes. Mark! Adama ordered. The entire fleet fired. Everything. The Galactica's batteries were completely empty, but Ty had secretly held one final reserve. 2 kinetic rounds. He had kept them absolutely quiet, told no one, and stashed them securely against the precise moment that mattered most. He fired both simultaneously on bearing 165, his absolute last act as a gunner. The Norway's phasers blindingly swept the bearing. The Saratoga's turbo phasers and torpedoes brutally hammered it. Lee's Mark 7 wing violently dove toward the screen in a highly concentrated assault. The Raptors rapidly shifted their ECM to the second base star's exact coordination frequency, effectively jamming the starboard swarm for the very first time in the entire engagement. Every single gun, every energy beam, every explosive warhead the fleet had left was entirely focused on one incredibly narrow corridor of space. Raiders directly on bearing 165 simply died. A massive gap tore wide open in the defensive screen. It was a narrow, fleeting corridor carved directly through overlapping fields of fire by the combined terrifying output of 2 different civilizations. 15 seconds. Maybe less. 2 minutes. Starbuck turned. She pointed the Viper's nose directly at the gap and ripped the throttle open to absolute maximum. The Mark II accelerated with a brutal violence that physically crushed her back into the seat and turned her vision dark gray at the edges. The engine, running substantially cooler than it had ever run, the thermal management composites doing their brilliant work, pushed the Viper far past its rated maximum, launching it into a velocity range the original colonial engineers had never once designed for, and that the Duranium wing routes now made entirely possible. The gap was rapidly closing. Raiders were frantically converging from both sides, weapons desperately tracking, automated point defense attempting to lock onto a single Viper moving far faster than their targeting parameters could possibly compensate for. Rounds passed terrifyingly close around her. The sharp metallic ping of near misses echoed through the hull, each one a death sentence if the subject ever stood still. She hit the gap at full burn, right through the violently closing corridor, raiders swarming on both sides. The pings became a relentless, continuous rattle. Kinetic rounds were close enough to taste. She was through. The base star entirely filled her canopy. The double Y structure was enormous at this extreme range, a jagged mountain of dark metal, its massive launch bays gaping along the central axis like open, hungry throats. 1 minute. On the base star's command level, the three watched the single colonial fighter cleanly breach the radar screen. Her tactical systems tracked the Viper's velocity, calculated the trajectory, and precisely assessed the massive airframe stress. At that impossible speed, a standard Colonial Mark II would definitively suffer wing root failure in approximately 45 seconds. The structural limits were known. The math was absolutely certain. The three coolly dismissed the contact. The math was entirely correct, but only for a Mark II that hadn't spent a night being completely rebuilt on the Norway's hangar deck. 30 seconds. Starbuck fired the Javelin at exactly 200 meters. The Colonial missile, carrying a Starfleet Federation photon warhead on an improvised adapter collar built by a brilliant Starfleet engineer in exactly 13 minutes, left the wing pylon and crossed the distance directly into the base star's open launch bay in less than a second. It entered the hangar. It passed cleanly through the launch space. It struck an interior bulkhead deep inside the base star's superstructure. The photon warhead violently detonated. The explosion began deep inside and expanded violently outward. Antimatter annihilation, converting internal physical structure directly to sheer energy in a massive sphere of destruction that tore ruthlessly through command systems, radar bays, data pools, and neural architecture. The base star came completely apart in massive sections. The hull blew outward in sequence as the devastating blast wave propagated, each section totally failing as the detonation reached it. The three had exactly 1.3 seconds between detonation and the total destruction of her command chamber. Her tactical systems perfectly registered the energy signature: Federation, photon warhead, antimatter yield. She had been killed by a weapon that absolutely did not exist on any colonial manifest, delivered flawlessly by a fighter whose airframe should have failed 30 seconds ago, built by an unseen engineer whose name she would never even know. The radar screen entirely collapsed. 300 raiders, their command ship destroyed, coordination severed, and tactical hierarchy eliminated, blindly scattered into the void, their programming defaulting to pure evasion. Starbuck pulled out at the absolute last second. The Viper's nose came sharply up. The port pylon completely empty now. The ship suddenly beautifully lighter. She pulled punishing G-forces that grayed her vision completely and turned the strained muscles in her neck to liquid fire. The Viper screamed past the rapidly disintegrating hull, close enough to physically feel the heat radiating through the canopy. The wing roots held. Part 10. The aftermath. The first base star, the one whose raider swarm had been thoroughly gutted in the Federation kill zone, the one now sitting entirely alone in space with a tightly contracted defensive screen and no partner, registered the catastrophic destruction of its sister ship. The three aboard stared at the tactical display and understood. Her sister at the neutral zone, the one commanding the massive assault on the Enterprise and Kronos 1, was currently fighting a battle, the outcome of which she did not yet know. The sister beside her was dead, killed by a weapon that shouldn't exist, delivered by a pilot who should have rightfully died, supported by an impossible alliance that should never have formed. She was the last. If she died here, the number 3 line ended. No resurrection. Cavil had permanently severed their access to the hub. Every 3 that fell was gone forever. 2 sisters dead, 1 remaining. The calculus was absolute. All raiders, defensive withdrawal. Set coordinates for deep space, emergency jump. The first base star's FTL drive rapidly spooled. The surviving raiders, battered, diminished, their massive swarm reduced to a mere fraction of what had jumped in 40 minutes ago, frantically converged on the base star's hull. The ship perfectly aligned on a vector that pointed far away from the fleet, far away from the Federation ships, far away from absolutely everything. The last 3 looked at the tactical display one final time. The Colonial Fleet. 63 ships, entirely intact. 2 battle stars, 3 Federation warships, a burning debris field where her sister's base star had just been. She jumped. The void was empty. The battle was over. Part 11. Battlestar Galactica. Hangar deck. Starbuck's landing was undeniably the worst of her entire career. The Viper came in entirely too steep and too fast. The port landing skid, heavily weakened by the Javelin's brutal mounting stress, buckling violently on contact. The bird slewed sideways entirely across the deck in a massive shower of sparks, scraping a deep gouge into the plating before violently slamming into the maintenance bay barrier, with a sickening crunch that brought every hand on the deck running. Tyrell reached her first. He hit the canopy release. The cockpit cracked open. Starbuck was inside, tightly strapped in, visor up, her face stark white with G-force bruising, dark blood running freely from her nose, her hands trembling violently on the flight stick. She was grinning. "Hey, Chief, Captain." The bird held. She coughed. Blood in the cough. The wing roots held. Tel Reyes, another cough. Tell Reyes her laminate works. Tyrol looked closely at the Viper. The port wing was entirely intact, heavily stressed, deeply scored, the leading edge warped from intense thermal exposure during the incredibly close pass on the detonating Baystar, but entirely structurally sound. The geranium composite reinforcement had miraculously survived a flight profile that exceeded every single parameter it was ever designed for. The wing route that would have absolutely failed 2 weeks ago, the exact one he'd warned her about, the one that had kept him awake at night, had held. He helped her slowly out of the cockpit. She leaned on him far more than she would ever admit. He took her weight completely without comment, because that is exactly what chiefs do. Medical captain, now, in a minute. She put her hand flat on the port wing. The wing that held, the wing that Reyes had meticulously fixed, the wing that carried a live Federation torpedo straight into a Cylon Baystar's throat at a velocity that should have killed her. She just stood there with her hand on the cold metal and didn't speak. Tyrol stood quietly beside her. He didn't speak either. In CIC, Adama picked up the heavy shipwide comm. All hands. This is the Admiral. Both Cylon Baystars have been neutralized. One destroyed, one withdrawn. The fleet is secure. He paused. 63 ships, all accounted for. Well done. All of you, well done. He set the comm down. Ty stood silently beside him, his face completely unreadable, his hands rigidly clasped behind his back. 2 rounds, Saul? 2 rounds, Bill? You held back ammunition from your commanding officer. I held back ammunition for the moment it mattered. Adama looked at his executive officer, the man who had personally held his ship together through a grueling year of running, who had managed the entire fleet's logistics, morale, and maintenance with the grim professionalism of an old warhorse who adamantly refused to stop pulling, and who had quietly stashed exactly 2 rounds of ammunition against the terrifying chance that absolutely everything else failed, and one more shot was the sole difference between survival and extinction. Don't ever do that again. Aye, sir. They both knew he would.